My name is Marcus Aldridge, and I've been a deputy with the Harney County Sheriff's Office for 9 years now. 9 years of patrolling some of the most remote territory in the continental United States. 9 years of learning that out here. The rulebook only gets you so far. You learn to read situations differently when backup is 40 minutes away on a good day. You learn to trust the feeling in your gut when something's off, because sometimes that feeling is the only warning you're going to get. I've worked domestics in ranch houses 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. I've tracked lost hunters through wilderness that doesn't care whether you live or die. I've made decisions alone in the dark that I had to live with long after the paperwork was filed. This job changes you. It has to, because the alternative is that the job breaks you, and I've seen that happen too. I'm telling you this so you understand where I was coming from on the day everything changed. I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought 9 years had taught me enough. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things that day. Harney County covers over 10,000 square miles of high desert, national forest, and open rangeland. To put that in perspective, that's larger than some states on the East Coast. Our population hovers around 7,000 people, which means there are stretches of this county where you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle. The nearest city of any real size is Burns, and even that's just a small town by most standards. We have mountains, we have wetlands, we have pine forests so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground. We have places where cell service is a memory and radio contact is a gamble. Most people who live here chose this life because they wanted space, wanted quiet, wanted to be left alone. That's fine by me. I respect that. But it also means that when something goes wrong out here, it goes wrong in isolation. There's no crowd of witnesses, no security cameras on every corner, no quick response from neighboring jurisdictions. It's just you, the land, and whatever situation you've walked into. You either handle it or you don't. There's no middle ground. Working alone in territory like this teaches you things that academy training never covers. You learn to watch how people hold their hands when they're talking to you. You learn to notice which questions make someone pause a half-second too long before answering. You learn to catalog details without appearing to pay attention, because sometimes the thing that saves your life is something you noticed an hour earlier and filed away without knowing why. Instinct isn't magic. It's pattern recognition built from thousands of interactions, thousands of calls, thousands of moments where you had to decide in a split second whether someone was telling the truth. After 9 years, those patterns become part of how you see the world. You stop being able to turn it off. You read people in the grocery store, at the gas station, at your kids' school events. Most of the time, it's just background noise. But every once in a while, that background noise becomes a signal, a warning, something your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet, but your body already knows. I've learned to listen to that signal. It's kept me alive more than once. The problem is, sometimes by the time the signal gets loud enough to hear, you're already in too deep to back out. The day I'm going to tell you about was October 23rd. Late October in eastern Oregon means the weather is turning, the days are getting short, and the high desert is starting to remember that winter is coming. A cold front had been pushing down from Canada all week, dropping temperatures into the 30s at night and keeping them in the low 50s during the day. The sky that morning was that particular shade of pale blue you only see in autumn, when the atmosphere is dry and the light comes in at a low angle. Beautiful if you had time to appreciate it. I didn't. I'd been on shift since 6 in the morning, handling the usual mix of calls that come with the start of a weekday. A minor traffic accident on Highway 20, a rancher reporting a downed fence line, paperwork from the weekend that still needed filing. Nothing urgent, nothing memorable, just the ordinary rhythm of the job. The kind of morning where you drink your coffee and watch the hours pass and figure today will be like yesterday and tomorrow will be like today. That's how most days go. The ones that don't start out feeling different. They start out feeling exactly the same, and then somewhere along the way, they become something else entirely. The call came in around 9:30 that morning. A missing person report, relayed from the Burns office to all units in the eastern sector. A 28-year-old woman named Sarah Vance had been reported missing by her boyfriend, a man named Tyler Reed. According to Tyler, Sarah had left their rental cabin the previous afternoon to go hiking alone. She'd told him she'd be back before dark. When she wasn't back by midnight, he'd gone looking for her car at the trailheads in the area. He found it around 2 in the morning at the Idlewild campground lot, about 15 miles into the national forest. The car was locked. Her keys were inside, sitting on the passenger seat. Her phone was in the center console. There was no sign of Sarah herself. Tyler had waited until first light to report it, thinking maybe she'd gotten lost and would find her way back once she could see. That hadn't happened. By the time I heard the call, she'd been missing for approximately 18 hours. 18 hours in October. 18 hours with temperatures dropping below freezing overnight. The window for finding her alive was already starting to close. Missing hikers are more common than people think. Most of them turn up within the first day. They twist an ankle 3 miles from the trailhead and have to wait for someone to find them. They take a wrong turn, lose the trail, and spend a panicked night huddled under a tree before orienting themselves in the morning light. They underestimate distance, overestimate their fitness, and end up exhausted but alive when search teams locate them. That's the usual story, the reassuring story. But every deputy in a rural county knows the other stories too. The ones where the search goes on for days and ends with a body. The ones where the search never ends at all, where someone just disappears into the wilderness and the land keeps its secrets. I've been on both kinds of searches. You hope for the first, you prepare for the second, and you try not to think too hard about the statistics, because statistics don't help when you're the one walking the grid and calling someone's name into the trees. Sarah Vance was 28 years old. She was an experienced hiker, according to the boyfriend. She knew the area. She should have been fine. But her car was at the trailhead. Her keys were inside and she was nowhere to be found. Those facts told a story I didn't want to hear. By mid-afternoon, a full search operation had been organized. The sheriff's office coordinated with the Forest Service, the county search and rescue team, and the usual network of local volunteers who show up whenever someone goes missing in the backcountry. We set up a staging area at the Idlewild campground parking lot, right next to Sarah's car. Maps were distributed. Grid assignments were made. Teams were paired up and sent out in different directions, each covering a designated sector based on the most likely routes Sarah might have taken. The terrain in that area is challenging. Dense pine forest, steep ravines, creek beds that cut through the landscape like veins. Easy to get lost, easy to get hurt. The kind of country that can turn a simple day hike into a survival situation if you make one wrong decision. We had maybe 4 hours of good daylight left. After that, the search would have to pause until morning. 4 hours to cover as much ground as possible. 4 hours to find some sign of where Sarah had gone. The clock was running, and none of us knew yet just how much we didn't know. In rural Oregon, civilian volunteers aren't just welcomed on searches. They're essential. We don't have the manpower to cover thousands of acres on our own. The Forest Service helps, but their resources are stretched thin too. When someone disappears out here, the community responds. Ranchers who know the land better than any map. Hunters who've spent decades learning every ridge and drainage. Retired folks with time on their hands and a genuine desire to help. They show up at the staging area with their own boots, their own gear, their own willingness to walk for hours through difficult terrain. Most of them have no training. Most of them have no idea what they're doing beyond the basic instructions we give them. But their presence multiplies our coverage area, and in a missing persons case, coverage is everything. You're not looking for a needle in a haystack. You're looking for a person in a landscape that's actively trying to hide them. Every extra pair of eyes matters. Every additional searcher increases the odds. That's the theory anyway. The theory assumes that everyone who shows up to help actually wants to help. The theory doesn't account for the exceptions. I was assigned to coordinate with a group of civilian volunteers and search a sector in the eastern portion of the grid. The area covered a drainage that ran roughly northeast from the campground, following a creek bed through old-growth forest before climbing into higher terrain. It was one of the more difficult sectors, requiring a hike of several miles each way over uneven ground. Not the kind of assignment you give to inexperienced volunteers. I was supposed to assess the group, pair them appropriately, and take the strongest hikers into the rougher terrain while directing others to easier sectors. Standard procedure, nothing complicated. I'd done this kind of coordination dozens of times before. You meet the volunteers, you figure out who can handle what, you make assignments, and you get moving. Time matters in these situations. Every minute you spend organizing is a minute you're not searching. I wanted to get my team into the field as quickly as possible. I wanted to find Sarah before the sun went down. I didn't know yet that finding Sarah wasn't the real danger that day. The real danger was standing in the staging area, waiting patiently for his assignment. Nothing about the call felt unusual at that point. Missing hiker, car at the trailhead, boyfriend reports her overdue, search organized, Volunteers assembled. The script was familiar. The motions were practiced. I had no reason to think this case would be different from the dozens of others I'd worked over the years. Most missing persons cases resolve themselves within 48 hours, one way or another. You find the person. You find evidence of what happened to the person. Or the person turns up on their own, embarrassed and apologetic, with a story about getting turned around or losing track of time. That's how it usually goes. The wilderness is dangerous, but it's not malevolent. It doesn't hunt you. It just exists, indifferent to your survival, and most people who get lost in it eventually get found. I was thinking about logistics that afternoon, coverage patterns, daylight hours, grid efficiency. I was thinking like a coordinator, not like an investigator. I wasn't looking for anything other than a lost woman who needed to be brought home. I wasn't watching for predators. I should have been. I should have been watching from the moment I arrived at that staging area. The volunteers had gathered near the command post, about 15 people in total. I walked over to introduce myself and start the assessment process. Most of them were familiar types. A few older men in hunting jackets. A couple of younger guys who looked like they spent their weekends trail running. 2 women in their 40s with the practical gear and no-nonsense demeanor of experienced hikers. I was scanning the group, sorting them mentally into categories, when I noticed one man standing slightly apart from the others. He was early 30s, average height, wearing appropriate clothing and carrying a day pack that looked well used but well maintained. He wasn't doing anything unusual. He wasn't saying anything. He was just waiting, calmly, for instructions. But something about him caught my attention in a way I couldn't immediately explain. He looked ready. Not nervous, the way most volunteers are. Not overeager, the way some people get when they want to be heroes. Just ready, composed, present, like he knew exactly why he was there and exactly what he was going to do. At the time, I took it as a good sign. A competent volunteer, someone I could rely on. I walked over to introduce myself and get his name. He shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and smiled. His name was Kyle Weber, and he was there to help. Kyle Weber had the kind of handshake that tells you something about a person before they say a word. Firm but not aggressive, confident but not performative. The grip of someone who's comfortable in their own skin, who doesn't need to prove anything through physical intimidation. He met my eyes when he shook my hand, which sounds like a small thing but isn't. You'd be surprised how many people can't do that. They look at your chin, your forehead, somewhere just past your shoulder. Not Kyle. He looked right at me, steady and direct, and introduced himself like we were meeting at a neighborhood barbecue instead of a missing persons staging area. Early 30s, I estimated. Clean-shaven, brown hair cut short and practical. He was wearing broken-in hiking boots, cargo pants with the kind of reinforced knees you see on people who actually use them, and a fleece jacket layered over what looked like a moisture-wicking base layer. Everything about his appearance suggested someone who knew what they were doing outdoors. Not a weekend warrior showing up in brand-new REI gear. Not a concerned citizen in sneakers and jeans. A prepared individual who'd done this before. I remember thinking that was a good sign. I remember being relieved. He told me he was a friend of Tyler Reed's, the boyfriend who had reported Sarah missing. They'd known each other since college, he said. Roommates for 2 years, stayed in touch after graduation. When Tyler called him that morning, frantic and barely coherent, Kyle had gotten in his car immediately. He'd driven 3 hours from Bend to get here, pushing the speed limit the whole way because that's what you do when a friend calls you in crisis. That's what you do when someone you care about is in trouble. He said all of this matter-of-factly, without drama or self-congratulation. Just explaining how he came to be standing in a parking lot in the middle of nowhere on a Thursday afternoon. The story made sense. It was exactly the kind of story you'd expect from a loyal friend responding to an emergency. I had no reason to question it. I had no reason to wonder why Tyler himself wasn't at the staging area, though I learned later he'd been asked to stay at the rental cabin in case Sarah came back on her own. Standard practice. Keep the reporting party available. Kyle had come in his place, a friend stepping up when another friend couldn't. Admirable, really. I asked him about his experience with backcountry hiking, and he gave me a rundown that checked every box. He'd been hiking and camping since childhood, he said. His father had taken him into the Cascades every summer growing up, taught him how to read terrain, how to navigate without GPS, how to stay calm when things went wrong. As an adult, he'd done multi-day trips in the Sierra Nevada, the Olympic Peninsula, the Frank Church Wilderness in Idaho. He wasn't bragging. He was answering my question, providing the information I needed to make an assignment decision. He mentioned that he'd done volunteer search and rescue work a few times in Deschutes County. Though he wasn't formally certified, he knew how grid searches worked. He knew the importance of staying in your lane, covering your sector thoroughly, not freelancing. He asked intelligent questions about the terrain we'd be searching, the communication protocols, the signals to use if he found something. The questions themselves told me he understood what we were doing. This wasn't his first time walking into the woods looking for someone who might not want to be found, or might not be able to be found. He was taking it seriously. He was treating it like what it was. When I explained the sector assignments, Kyle volunteered for the most difficult quadrant without hesitation. The eastern drainage, 4 miles in, rough terrain, limited visibility under the canopy. The kind of search area that would exhaust most civilians within the first hour. I told him it was going to be a hard hike, that we might not be back before dark, that the footing was treacherous in places and the creek bed would require multiple crossings over slick rocks. He nodded and said he understood. Said he'd rather be somewhere difficult, where he might actually make a difference, than somewhere easy where a dozen other people could cover the same ground. That was the right answer. That was exactly what you want to hear from a volunteer. Most people want to help, but they want to help in a way that's comfortable. They want to feel useful, without actually suffering. Kyle was different. He wanted to go where the search needed him most, even if it meant pushing himself to the limit. I made the decision right there to pair myself with him. If he was as capable as he seemed, having him with me in the rough terrain would double our effectiveness. If he wasn't, I needed to be there to manage the situation. Either way, keeping him close made sense. We left the staging area around 3:15, heading northeast along a fire road that would take us to the trailhead for our sector. The afternoon light was already starting to angle low through the trees, that golden autumn quality that photographers love and search coordinators dread. It meant we had maybe 3 hours before the light became unreliable, maybe 4 before full dark. Not enough time to cover the entire drainage, but enough to make a solid push into the interior and establish whether there were any obvious signs of Sarah's passage. Kyle walked beside me on the fire road, matching my pace exactly. Not lagging behind, not pushing ahead, just moving in sync, conserving energy for the harder terrain to come. We didn't talk much during that first stretch. There wasn't much to say. The mission was clear, the clock was running, and conversation would come later if it came at all. I appreciated the silence. Too many volunteers feel the need to fill every moment with chatter, nervous energy spilling out as words. Kyle seemed to understand that sometimes the best thing you can do is just walk. The fire road ended at a narrow trail that descended into the drainage, switchbacking down a steep slope covered in pine needles and loose rock. This was where the real search began. The canopy closed overhead as we dropped below the ridgeline, cutting the available light by half. The air temperature dropped noticeably. The forest floor was a maze of fallen logs, exposed roots, and undergrowth that grabbed at your ankles with every step. Kyle navigated it all without complaint. He placed his feet carefully, used his hands for balance when necessary, and kept his eyes moving constantly, scanning the terrain ahead and to the sides. I watched him work and felt my initial assessment confirmed. This was someone who belonged in the backcountry, someone who'd spent enough time in difficult terrain that it had become second nature. His movements were economical, efficient, the kind of practiced grace that only comes from repetition. We reached the creek bed about 45 minutes after leaving the fire road. From here, the plan was to follow the water upstream, checking the banks and the surrounding forest for any sign of Sarah. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, clothing caught on branches, anything that might tell us she'd passed this way. We began calling her name as we moved upstream. That's standard procedure in a missing persons search. You call the name at regular intervals, loud enough to be heard over the ambient noise of the forest. Then you stop and listen for a response. Most of the time there is no response. Most of the time, you're calling into emptiness, your voice swallowed by the trees and the distance and the indifferent silence of the wilderness. But you do it anyway, because the one time someone answers, it makes every unanswered call worthwhile. Kyle and I fell into a rhythm. I would call, we would both listen, then we would move forward another 100 yards and repeat. His voice was strong and clear when it was his turn to call. No hesitation, no embarrassment. Some people feel foolish shouting a stranger's name into the woods. Kyle treated it like the serious work it was. Sarah. The name echoed off the canyon walls and faded into nothing. Sarah. Again and again as we pushed deeper into the drainage. The creek gurgled beside us, oblivious to our purpose. Just water doing what water does. The forest watched in silence. Between calls, Kyle talked about Sarah. Not constantly, not obsessively, but in the natural way someone talks about a person they're worried about. He mentioned that she loved hiking, had been doing it since she was a teenager. She'd grown up in Colorado, he said, where the mountains were steeper and the trails were more demanding. Oregon was supposed to be easier for her, more accessible. But she had a tendency to underestimate distances, to push a little farther than she'd planned because she wanted to see what was around the next bend. It was one of the things Tyler loved about her, that adventurous streak. But it worried him too. She wasn't reckless exactly, just optimistic, just confident in her own abilities in a way that sometimes outpaced reality. Kyle said she'd forgotten to charge her phone more than once on previous hikes, had come back after dark with Tyler frantic and her apologetic, promising it wouldn't happen again. These details felt authentic. They felt like the kind of things a friend would know about a friend's girlfriend. The kind of observations that accumulate over years of proximity, of shared dinners and weekend trips and late-night conversations. I found myself liking Kyle as we hiked. He was easy to be around. No ego, no need to dominate the conversation or prove himself superior. He asked me questions about the job, about how long I'd been a deputy, about what it was like to work in such an isolated county. The questions were genuine, not just polite noise to fill silence. He listened to my answers and asked follow-ups that showed he was actually paying attention. When I mentioned that backup was often 40 minutes away, he nodded and said he couldn't imagine that kind of responsibility, being alone with a situation and knowing no one was coming to help. He said it with respect, not flattery. Just an acknowledgement of a reality he hadn't considered before. I told him you get used to it, which is true, and that you learn to trust your judgment, which is also true. What I didn't tell him was that sometimes your judgment is wrong. Sometimes you trust the wrong things. Sometimes the danger isn't in the situation you're walking into, but in the person walking beside you. I didn't tell him that because I didn't know it yet. I was still thinking of Kyle as an asset, not a variable. I was still thinking of him as help. The terrain grew more difficult as we moved upstream. The creek bed narrowed, forcing us to cross the water repeatedly as the banks became impassable on one side or the other. The rocks were slick with moss and algae, requiring careful foot placement to avoid a slip that could mean a twisted ankle or worse. Kyle handled the crossings without difficulty, testing each foothold before committing his weight, maintaining his balance with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. We were making good progress, covering ground efficiently, our calls echoing through the drainage at regular intervals. Sarah, no response. Sarah, nothing but the sound of water and wind and our own breathing. The light was fading faster than I'd hoped. The canopy overhead was thick enough that dusk came early down here, the shadows deepening while the sky above the ridgeline was still bright. I checked my watch. We had maybe 90 minutes before we'd need to start heading back. 90 minutes to push a little deeper, to cover a little more ground, to hope we'd find something that would tell us where Sarah had gone. By 5 o'clock, we'd covered nearly 3 miles of the drainage without finding any sign of her. No footprints in the soft soil along the creek banks, no broken branches, no abandoned gear, nothing to suggest she'd ever been here. That wasn't necessarily bad news. It might mean she'd taken a different route, was lost in a different sector, would be found by a different team, but it wasn't good news either. Every negative result narrowed the possibilities, and some of those remaining possibilities were ones I didn't want to think about too carefully. Kyle remained focused throughout, his attention never wavering, his energy never flagging. He'd proven himself to be exactly what he'd appeared, a competent, dedicated volunteer who understood what we were doing and was committed to doing it well. I remember thinking, as we paused at a small waterfall to catch our breath and reassess our route, that if all volunteers were like Kyle Weber, searches would go faster and end better. I remember thinking I was lucky to have him as a partner on this one. I remember thinking I could trust him. That's the part that stays with me now, years later. That certainty I felt, that confidence. I was so sure I knew who I was dealing with. I had no idea. Not yet. 2 hours into the search, something changed. I couldn't have told you what it was at the time. It wasn't a single moment, a clear break between before and after. It was more like a splinter working its way under the skin, so small you almost don't notice it. But once it's there, you can't stop feeling it. We were still moving upstream, still calling Sarah's name into the gathering dusk, still covering ground with the steady efficiency that had characterized our entire search. Kyle was still the same competent partner he'd been since we left the staging area. Nothing about his behavior had shifted in any obvious way, but somewhere in the back of my mind, a question had formed, a small one, insignificant, really. The kind of question you ask yourself and then immediately dismiss because the answer seems so obvious. Except I didn't dismiss it. I filed it away instead, in that mental drawer where cops keep the things that don't quite fit, the things that might mean something later or might mean nothing at all. You never know which, until you do. We had stopped to rest near a bend in the creek, where the water pooled into a small basin before continuing downstream. The rocks here were flat and dry, good for sitting, and we'd been on our feet for hours without a real break. Kyle pulled a water bottle from his pack and drank deeply, then offered me some trail mix he'd brought. I took a handful, grateful for the calories. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the creek and the wind in the trees overhead. It was Kyle who broke the silence. He was looking upstream, toward where the drainage narrowed into steeper terrain, and he said something almost to himself. He said that Sarah would have loved this spot, that she always preferred trails with water features, streams and waterfalls and alpine lakes, that she'd mentioned this particular area once, said she wanted to explore it someday. He said it casually, the way you'd mention any piece of trivia about someone you knew, but the words landed differently than he intended. They landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. I asked him how he knew that. It was a simple question, asked in a neutral tone, the kind of follow-up anyone might make in a normal conversation. How do you know she liked trails with water features? How do you know she'd talked about this area? The questions weren't accusatory. They weren't suspicious. They were just questions. But Kyle paused before answering. It was a small pause, maybe half a second, maybe less. The kind of pause that most people wouldn't even notice, that would disappear into the flow of conversation without leaving a trace. But I noticed it. I noticed it because I've spent 9 years asking questions and watching how people respond. I've learned that the pause before an answer often matters more than the answer itself. It's the moment when the brain is working, calculating, deciding what to say. Most people pause because they're remembering. Some people pause because they're constructing. The difference is subtle, but it's real, and after enough practice, you start to sense which one you're seeing. Kyle's pause felt like the second kind, like he was building something rather than retrieving it. He said Tyler must have mentioned it during the drive up from Bend. Said they'd talked about Sarah the whole way. 3 hours of Tyler going over every detail he could think of, hoping something would help the search. Tyler had told him about her hiking preferences, her favorite spots, the places she'd always wanted to visit. This drainage was one of them, apparently. Sarah had seen it on a map once, and said it looked beautiful. Said she wanted to explore it when the weather was right. Kyle delivered this explanation smoothly, naturally, the words flowing in that easy cadence I'd grown accustomed to over the past 2 hours. It was a perfectly reasonable answer. It made complete sense. Tyler was worried. Tyler was talking. Tyler was sharing everything he knew about the woman he loved in the desperate hope that some detail would prove useful. Of course, he'd mentioned her preferences. Of course, Kyle would remember. There was nothing suspicious about it. Nothing at all. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Not wrong exactly, just off, like a picture hanging slightly crooked on a wall. We continued upstream after the break, pushing into terrain that grew increasingly difficult. The creek bed narrowed, the banks steepened, and the undergrowth thickened to the point where we were sometimes forcing our way through, rather than walking freely. Kyle suggested we check a ravine that branched off to the east, a small tributary drainage that climbed up toward the ridgeline. He framed it as intuition, a feeling that something about that direction was right. He said he couldn't explain it, just had a sense that we should look over there. I agreed. Intuition matters in search and rescue. Sometimes people find things because they followed a hunch that had no logical basis. The wilderness is too big to search systematically in the time we usually have. You cover the most likely areas first, and then you start following instincts. Kyle's suggestion was as good as any other direction we might have chosen. Better, maybe, because at least he had a feeling about it. I had nothing but a map and a growing awareness that we were running out of daylight. The ravine was steeper than I'd expected, the footing treacherous with loose scree and decomposing vegetation. Kyle led the way, picking a route up the slope with what seemed like practiced ease. I followed, watching where he placed his feet, trying to match his line. We called Sarah's name at intervals. our voices echoing off the narrow walls of the drainage. No response. Just the wind and the sound of our own breathing, labored now from the climb. About halfway up, I suggested we angle back toward the main creek bed. The ravine was proving difficult, and I wasn't sure it was worth the effort when we had so much other ground to cover. Kyle countered with a suggestion that we push just a little farther, just to the next bend, just to see what was around the corner. He said it the way he'd said everything else that day, calm and reasonable. But I noticed that he was steering me, gently, logically, but definitely steering. Every time I proposed a direction, he found a reason to modify it. Every time I suggested turning back, he found a way to keep us moving forward. I started paying closer attention after that. Not obviously, not in any way that would signal suspicion. Just watching, cataloging, noting the pattern of his suggestions and where they led us. We were moving through the drainage in what seemed like a random search pattern, but the more I watched, the less random it appeared. Kyle's intuitions always pointed in specific directions. His hunches always favored certain terrain over others. When I suggested checking a particular side canyon, he agreed readily, but then found a reason to cut the inspection short. When I proposed doubling back to cover an area we'd passed quickly, he raised concerns about time and efficiency. Each individual suggestion was defensible. Each redirection made sense on its own terms, but taken together, they formed a pattern that said Kyle Weber had a destination in mind, even if he wasn't admitting it. Even if he might not have been fully aware of it himself. Volunteers get fixated sometimes. They develop theories about where the missing person might be and unconsciously steer the search toward those theories. It's a known phenomenon. It's usually harmless. But Kyle's suggestions didn't feel like theory. They felt like knowledge. There's a difference between someone who thinks they know where to look and someone who actually knows. The first kind is uncertain, tentative, ready to be proven wrong. They suggest directions with phrases like maybe, and I wonder if, and what do you think about? They defer to the professionals because they understand their intuitions are just guesses. Kyle wasn't like that. His suggestions came with a quiet confidence that bordered on certainty. He didn't ask what I thought. He didn't frame his hunches as possibilities. He presented them as logical conclusions, obvious next steps, directions that any reasonable person would choose. And when I pushed back, he didn't yield. He negotiated. He found compromises that still moved us where he wanted to go. It was subtle, so subtle that I might have missed it entirely if I hadn't been watching. If that first pause, that half-second hesitation when I asked how he knew about Sarah's preferences, hadn't put me on alert. The splinter was working deeper now. I could feel it with every step. I told myself I was being paranoid. Told myself the long day was getting to me, that fatigue was making me see patterns that weren't there. This happens on searches. You spend hours looking for something, and your brain starts finding significance in everything. A broken branch becomes a clue. A bird call becomes a signal. You start connecting dots that aren't actually connected, building narratives out of random noise. I'd seen other deputies do it. I'd done it myself, on other cases, in other circumstances. The mind wants to find meaning. The mind wants to solve the puzzle. And when there's nothing to find, the mind starts inventing things. That's what was happening here, I told myself. Kyle was just a motivated volunteer with strong opinions about search strategy. His suggestions were just hunches, informed by whatever Tyler had told him during that 3-hour drive. The pause before his answer was just him remembering, not constructing. I was reading too much into too little. I needed to focus on the search, not on my own paranoid fantasies. We reached the top of the ravine as the light began to fail in earnest. The sky above the trees was still holding on to the last blue of afternoon, but down here in the drainage, dusk had already arrived. The shadows were deep and getting deeper. In another 30 minutes, we wouldn't be able to see well enough to search effectively. I made the call to start heading back. We'd covered a lot of ground, found nothing, and pushing further in diminishing light would only increase the risk of injury without meaningfully improving our chances of finding Sarah. Kyle accepted the decision without argument, which surprised me slightly. I'd expected him to push for more time, more distance, one more ridge to check. But he just nodded and said I was right, said we'd done good work, said hopefully one of the other teams had found something. His easy acceptance should have reassured me. It should have told me that my suspicions were unfounded, that he was just a normal volunteer following the lead of the professional. Instead, it made me more uneasy, because it felt like he'd gotten what he came for. Like our sector had served its purpose, whatever that purpose was. The hike back was quieter than the hike in. We were both tired, conserving energy for the difficult terrain, and the failing light demanded concentration. I walked behind Kyle this time, letting him set the pace while I watched his back and tried to sort through the thoughts churning in my head. The pattern I'd noticed could mean everything or nothing. The pause before his answer could be insignificant or crucial. The steering could be innocent fixation or something else entirely. I had no evidence of anything, just a feeling, just that splinter under the skin, working its way deeper with every step. By the time we reached the fire road and started the final leg back to the staging area, I'd almost convinced myself to let it go. Almost convinced myself that I was manufacturing suspicion where none was warranted. Kyle was a good volunteer. Kyle was Tyler's friend. Kyle had driven 3 hours to help find a missing woman. There was no reason to doubt him, no reason at all, except for that pause, except for that steering, except for the way he'd known exactly which trails Sarah preferred, exactly which areas she'd wanted to explore, except for the feeling I couldn't shake that Kyle Weber knew more than he was saying. But feelings aren't evidence. Feelings don't go in reports. So I pushed the thought aside and focused on putting one foot in front of the other, telling myself it was nothing, telling myself I was tired, telling myself that sometimes you see patterns that aren't there, and this was one of those times. I almost believed it. The next morning came too quickly. I'd gotten maybe 4 hours of sleep, broken and restless, my mind refusing to shut down completely even when my body demanded rest. We were back at the staging area by 7, the October sun just beginning to clear the ridgeline to the east. The cold front had pushed through overnight, dropping temperatures into the high 20s. Frost clung to the grass and glittered on the windshields of the vehicles gathered in the parking lot. More volunteers had arrived, word spreading through the community the way it always does when someone goes missing. The search coordinator briefed us on the overnight developments, which amounted to nothing. No sign of Sarah, no response to the calls that had echoed through a dozen drainages, no trace of her passage anywhere in the grid we'd covered the previous day. The window for finding her alive was narrowing with every hour that passed. Hypothermia was a real concern now. If she'd been injured somewhere, unable to move, unable to find shelter, another night of freezing temperatures might have been more than she could survive. The mood at the staging area was grim. Everyone felt the weight of it. Kyle was already there when I arrived, standing near the command post with a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked rested, alert, ready to go back out. When he saw me, he raised the cup in greeting and walked over. He asked how I'd slept, and I told him not well, which was true. He nodded sympathetically and said he'd had the same problem, that he'd lain awake thinking about Sarah, thinking about Tyler, thinking about all the places she might be that we hadn't checked yet. His concern seemed genuine. His frustration at our lack of progress seemed real. Everything about him was exactly what you'd expect from a friend of the family, invested in the outcome, desperate to help. I found myself wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, the pause, the steering, the pattern I'd thought I'd seen. In the cold light of morning, with the search resuming and real work to be done, my suspicions from the night before felt thin, insubstantial, the product of fatigue and an overactive imagination. Kyle was just a volunteer, just a friend trying to help. I needed to stop looking for shadows where there weren't any. We were assigned to the same sector as the previous day, tasked with pushing deeper into the drainage than we'd managed before. The search coordinator wanted to extend the grid into terrain that hadn't been covered yet, following the creek bed all the way to its source near the ridgeline. It was going to be a long day, harder than yesterday, with more elevation gain and more difficult footing. Kyle accepted the assignment without complaint, same as before. We gathered our gear and headed out, following the same fire road, the same trail, descending into the same drainage where we'd spent the previous afternoon calling Sarah's name. The forest was different in the morning light, the shadows falling in new directions, the familiar landmarks looking strange from unfamiliar angles. But the work was the same. Walk, call, listen, move forward, repeat. The rhythm of a search, monotonous and necessary, hope diminishing with every unanswered call. We pushed past the point where we'd turned back the night before, entering terrain we hadn't seen yet. The creek narrowed further. The walls of the drainage steepened. Radio contact, already unreliable, became increasingly intermittent. About 2 hours in, I tried to check in with the staging area and got nothing but static. We'd dropped too deep into the drainage, the terrain blocking the signal. I mentioned to Kyle that we should head for higher ground, maybe climb one of the side ridges until we could establish contact. Standard protocol when you lose comms. Let the coordinator know your position. Confirm that nothing's changed. Maintain situational awareness. It's not paranoia. It's just good practice. You don't disappear into the wilderness without keeping someone informed of where you are and what you're doing. Kyle listened to my suggestion and then offered a counterpoint. He said we were making good progress, covering new ground, and that climbing to higher ground would cost us at least an hour of search time. The daylight was limited. The window was closing. Wouldn't it make more sense to push forward while we could and check in when we naturally reached higher terrain later in the day? His argument was logical. His reasoning was sound. But something about it bothered me in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Most volunteers are eager for breaks. They want to stop, catch their breath, check their phones if they have signal. They want reassurance that they're doing things correctly, that the professionals approve of their efforts, that they're contributing meaningfully to the search. The volunteer mindset is fundamentally deferential. They're in unfamiliar territory, both literally and figuratively, and they look to law enforcement for guidance. That's normal. That's expected. Kyle didn't fit that pattern. He wasn't looking for reassurance. He wasn't seeking approval. He was pushing forward with a focus and determination that felt more like purpose than enthusiasm. When I suggested we check in, he didn't express any of the relief that most civilians show at the prospect of a break. He expressed impatience, subtle, controlled, wrapped in reasonable arguments about efficiency and daylight, but impatience nonetheless. He wanted to keep moving. He wanted to stay deep in the drainage, away from radio contact, away from oversight. And the more I thought about that, the more it bothered me. Not because it was evidence of anything, but because it was another piece that didn't quite fit the picture I'd been assembling of Kyle Weber, helpful friend and dedicated volunteer. I agreed to his suggestion, against my better judgment. We pushed deeper into the drainage, the terrain growing more challenging with every 100 yards. The creek bed was choked with fallen timber now, massive old-growth logs that had come down in past storms and never been cleared. We were climbing over and under obstacles constantly, the physical effort adding up, our progress slowing despite our best efforts. Kyle maintained his pace, navigating the difficult terrain with that same easy competence he'd displayed from the start. I was breathing hard, feeling the altitude and the accumulated fatigue of 2 days of hard hiking, but I kept up. I had to keep up. Because somewhere along the way, my decision to stay close to Kyle had shifted from tactical convenience to something else, something I wasn't ready to name yet, something that felt like surveillance. I was watching him now, not obviously, not in any way he could detect, but watching, nonetheless, looking for the thing that would confirm my suspicions or dismiss them entirely, looking for the piece that would make the pattern clear. That's when I noticed his boots. We had stopped to navigate a particularly difficult section of the creek bed, a place where the water dropped over a series of small falls, and the only way forward was to climb around on the steep bank. Kyle was ahead of me, working his way up a slope of loose rock and exposed roots. From my position below him, I had a clear view of his feet as he climbed. His boots were caked with mud, not fresh mud, not the wet soil we'd been walking through that morning. Dried mud, old mud. A distinctive reddish clay that I recognized immediately because I'd seen it before. It was the kind of clay you find near the creek beds in this drainage, in the low areas where the water pools and the soil stays saturated, distinctive enough that it stands out against the gray granite and brown pine needles that make up most of the ground cover in this area. Kyle's boots were coated in it, dried and cracked, clearly from a previous exposure that had been allowed to set. But we'd been walking for hours on dry terrain. Pine needles, granite outcrops, hard-packed soil on the fire road, nothing that would produce that kind of mud. I asked him casually when he'd arrived in the area, tried to keep my voice neutral, conversational, just making small talk while we navigated the difficult section. He said he'd gotten there yesterday morning, driven straight from Bend to the staging area, just like he'd told me before. He said he'd been in hiking boots the whole time because he knew he'd be going into the field as soon as he arrived. The answer was consistent with his earlier story. The answer made sense, but the mud on his boots didn't come from the staging area parking lot. The staging area was on high ground, dry and dusty, nowhere near the creek, and we hadn't walked through any clay deposits the previous day. I'd been paying attention to the terrain. I knew where we'd been. The mud on Kyle's boots came from somewhere else, somewhere in this drainage near the water, in the low ground where the clay accumulated, somewhere he'd been before today. somewhere he hadn't mentioned. Another detail that didn't fit. Another piece of the pattern I was trying not to see. I didn't say anything, didn't challenge his answer or point out the inconsistency. I just filed it away with the other observations, the growing collection of small things that added up to a picture I didn't want to look at directly. The pause before his answer about Sarah's preferences, the steering, the subtle redirection of our search toward certain areas, his reluctance to break for radio contact, and now the mud, the physical evidence of a presence in this terrain that predated his official arrival. Each detail was explainable on its own. Tyler told him about Sarah's hiking habits during the drive. Volunteers often develop strong intuitions about where to search. Efficient searchers push forward, rather than wasting time on check-ins. Maybe he'd done some preliminary scouting yesterday before the official briefing, eager to start looking. Any one of these explanations was plausible. Any one of them might be true. But taken together, they formed a pattern that said Kyle Weber had been in this drainage before, had been near the water, had been somewhere in this vast wilderness that he knew better than he was admitting. A pattern that said he knew something about where Sarah was. The thought was disturbing in ways I wasn't ready to fully process. If Kyle knew where Sarah was, why was he here? Why was he participating in the search? Why was he walking beside me, calling her name, acting like a concerned friend when he already knew the answer we were looking for? The only explanations I could think of were bad ones. The kind of explanations that change everything about a situation, that transform a missing person case into something much darker. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted the pattern to dissolve under scrutiny, to reveal itself as coincidence and imagination, rather than evidence of something terrible. But patterns don't lie. Patterns are the language the world uses to tell you things it can't say directly. You learn to read that language as a cop, or you don't survive. You learn to trust what the patterns are telling you, even when you don't want to hear it. The pattern emerging around Kyle Weber was saying something I couldn't ignore anymore. It was saying he wasn't who he claimed to be. It was saying this search wasn't what I thought it was. It was saying I might be in more danger than I'd realized. We continued forward after clearing the difficult section, Kyle leading the way as usual. I watched his back as we walked, watched the way he moved through the terrain with that practiced confidence, watched the mud-caked boots carrying him deeper into the drainage. I was thinking about the drive back to the staging area, about what I would say to the search coordinator, about how to raise suspicions without evidence, without anything concrete to point to. Just feelings, just patterns, just the accumulated weight of small things that didn't add up. It would sound paranoid. It might be paranoid. But the splinter was too deep now to ignore, and every step forward was taking me further from help, further from backup, further into isolation with a man I no longer trusted. I started inventorying the inconsistencies more deliberately, organizing them in my mind like entries in a report. The pause, the steering, the reluctance, the mud. 4 items on a list that might mean nothing or might mean everything. 4 pieces of a puzzle that might reveal something terrible when assembled. I didn't have the full picture yet, but I was starting to see its shape, and the shape was wrong. The shape was very, very wrong. The light was failing faster than I'd anticipated. We were nearly 5 miles from the trailhead now, deep in terrain that would be treacherous to navigate in darkness. The creek bed had become a narrow gorge, walls rising steeply on either side, the canopy overhead so thick that dusk arrived an hour early down here. I was calculating turnaround time in my head, figuring how long it would take us to get back before full dark, when Kyle stopped walking and turned to face me. He had a strange expression on his face, something I couldn't quite read, thoughtful, distant, like he was working through a problem that had been bothering him for a while. He asked if he could ask me something, and I said sure, expecting a question about search procedure or grid assignments or something equally mundane. What he asked instead changed everything. If someone did hurt her, he said, his voice quiet and contemplative, how long before a body would be hard to identify out here? With the animals, the weather, all of it? He framed it as morbid curiosity, a nervous thought that had been rattling around in his head and finally needed to be spoken aloud. He said he'd been trying not to think about it, but the longer the search went on without results, the harder it was to stay optimistic. He said he knew it was a dark question, maybe inappropriate, but he couldn't help wondering. His tone was apologetic, almost embarrassed, the way someone sounds when they're admitting to a thought they're not proud of. But I barely heard his disclaimers. I was stuck on 2 words that landed like stones in still water. Did hurt. Past tense. Certain. Not if something happened. Not if she's been injured. Did hurt. As if the question had already been answered. Everyone involved in a missing person search uses conditional language. It's instinctive. It's how you maintain hope while acknowledging uncertainty. You say if she's lost, and when we find her and whatever happened. You don't say did. You don't speak about the missing person's fate as if it's already been decided, because that means you've given up, and no one wants to be the first to give up. Tyler, the boyfriend, had been careful with his language when I'd heard him speak at the staging area. He'd said, when Sarah comes back and once we find her. The other volunteers spoke the same way. Even the veterans, the ones who'd been on enough searches to know how they sometimes end, maintained the fiction of uncertainty. It's not just optimism, it's protocol. It's respect for the possibility that you might be wrong. Kyle had just violated that protocol. Kyle had just spoken about Sarah as if her fate was already known, as if hope was a performance rather than a genuine state of mind. I gave him a vague answer, something about environmental factors and decomposition rates, wildlife activity and temperature fluctuations. I kept my voice neutral, professional, the way I would if any civilian asked a morbid question during a difficult search. I told him it varied depending on conditions, that the cold weather would slow some processes, but the animals in this area were active and opportunistic. I told him it wasn't something he should dwell on, that our job was to keep searching, keep hoping, keep calling her name until we had a reason to stop. The words came out automatically while my mind raced in a different direction entirely. The pattern wasn't a pattern anymore. It was a picture. A clear, coherent picture that explained everything I'd been seeing for the past 2 days. The pause, the steering, the mud on his boots, the knowledge he shouldn't have. And now this question, this carefully framed question that revealed more than he intended. Kyle Weber knew where Sarah was. He knew because he'd put her there. The realization arrived without fanfare. No dramatic music, no sudden flash of insight. Just a quiet certainty settling into my bones like cold water. I was standing 5 miles from the trailhead, in failing light, with no radio contact. Alone with a man who had almost certainly killed someone. A man who had driven 3 hours not to help find Sarah, but to control the search, to steer it away from wherever he'd left her, to walk beside law enforcement and play the role of the concerned friend while making sure we never got close to the truth. Everything he'd done made sense now. The volunteering for the difficult sector, the suggestions about where to search and where not to search, the reluctance to break for radio contact. He'd been managing this operation from the inside, using his position as a trusted volunteer to ensure that the search went exactly where he wanted it to go. And I'd let him. I'd welcomed his help. I'd praised his competence. I'd walked beside him for hours, trusting him completely, while he guided me further and further from backup. I looked at Kyle's face as these thoughts crystallized, searching for some sign of what was behind the mask. He looked back at me with an expression of mild embarrassment, still playing the role of the friend who'd asked an inappropriate question. His eyes were steady, calm, revealing nothing. No guilt, no fear, no hint that he understood what I'd just figured out. Or maybe he did understand, and he was simply that good at hiding it. Either way, I knew I couldn't let him see the shift in my thinking. I couldn't let him know that the game had changed, that I was no longer a partner but a threat. Because we were 5 miles from help, the light was dying, and I had no idea what he would do if he realized I knew. The only advantage I had was that he thought I was still fooled. He thought the mask was still working. I needed to keep it that way. I needed to get us both out of this drainage and back to the staging area without letting him suspect that everything between us had just fundamentally changed. I ran through my options while keeping my face carefully neutral. I was armed, my service weapon holstered on my right hip, loaded and ready. Kyle appeared unarmed, no visible weapons, but appearances mean nothing. A knife in a boot, a pistol in the waistband under that fleece jacket. A rock picked up from the creek bed when my back was turned. I had no way of knowing what he might be carrying, what he might be capable of if he felt cornered. And we were 5 miles from backup, in failing light, with no radio contact. If I confronted him now, the situation would become unpredictable in ways I couldn't control. He might run, he might fight, he might do something desperate that would end badly for one or both of us. The tactical calculus was simple and brutal. I had suspicions. I had pattern recognition. I had a gut feeling that had crystallized into near certainty. But I didn't have evidence. I didn't have backup. And I didn't have the element of surprise if he realized what I was thinking. The smartest play was to maintain the pretense, act normal, get us both out of the drainage and back to the staging area, where I could raise my concerns with the search coordinator, where there would be other deputies, where the situation could be handled properly. I suggested we mark our GPS position and start heading back before full dark. I framed it as protocol, liability, chain of command. The terrain was too dangerous to navigate without adequate light, and we'd already pushed further than any other team. We'd done good work. We could pick up where we left off tomorrow morning with fresh legs and better conditions. I delivered the suggestion in my most professional voice, the one I use when I'm explaining procedure to civilians who might want to argue. Reasonable, measured, the voice of someone who's just thinking about safety and efficiency, not someone who's realized he's alone in the wilderness with a killer. Kyle didn't agree immediately. He pushed back, gently, the way he'd been pushing back all day. He said we were close. He could feel it. He said Sarah might be just around the next bend, just over the next ridge, and turning back now would mean abandoning her for another night in the cold. He said he understood the protocols, respected my judgment, but couldn't we push just a little further? His arguments were reasonable. His tone was earnest. Anyone listening would have heard a dedicated volunteer reluctant to give up the search, but I was listening differently now. I heard the resistance beneath the reasonableness, the subtle pressure to keep me deep in the drainage, away from radio contact, away from help. He wanted to stay out here. He wanted us isolated, and every minute I spent arguing with him was a minute the light continued to fail, and our situation grew more precarious. I insisted, pulled rank in a way I hadn't needed to do until now. I told him the decision wasn't negotiable, that I was responsible for his safety as well as my own, and that we were heading back. Period. I watched his face as I spoke, looking for any sign that the mask was slipping, any indication that he understood what was really happening. For a long moment, he just looked at me. His expression was unreadable, that same calm composure he'd maintained since we first met. But something in his eyes had changed. A flicker of something that might have been calculation, assessment, like he was seeing me for the first time, really seeing me, and adjusting his understanding of what I represented. The moment stretched. The forest was silent around us, the creek gurgling somewhere below, the wind dead in the trees. Then he nodded, said I was right, said he was sorry for pushing, said we should head back. The walkout began with me in front, setting the pace, navigating the difficult terrain while hyper-aware of Kyle's position behind me. Every sound was amplified. Every footstep that wasn't mine registered like a gunshot. I could hear his breathing, steady and controlled. I could hear the crunch of pine needles under his boots. I could hear the small sounds of movement, the rustle of clothing, the occasional scrape of a hand against tree bark for balance. My skin prickled with the awareness of his presence at my back, the vulnerability of it, the exposure. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to keep him in sight, to not let him out of my field of vision for even a second. But turning around would signal suspicion. Turning around would tell him that something had changed. So I kept walking forward, kept my pace steady, kept my hand casually near my weapon without making it obvious. The terrain that had seemed merely difficult on the way in felt treacherous now. Every loose rock was a potential ankle injury that would leave me helpless. Every steep descent was an opportunity for a push from behind that could be explained as an accident. I found myself calculating angles, distances, reaction times. If he moved on me, how quickly could I draw? If he had a weapon, would I have time to respond? The thoughts were clinical, tactical, the trained part of my brain doing its job while the rest of me focused on putting one foot in front of the other. This was going to be the longest hike of my career. Every step taking me closer to safety. Every step survived another small victory. And behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing, Kyle Weber followed in silence, and I had no way of knowing what he was thinking about the back of my head. For 45 minutes, we walked through the darkening forest in a simulation of normalcy. I kept the conversation going, forcing words out of my mouth that had nothing to do with what I was actually thinking. I talked about the search, about the other sectors being covered, about the chances that another team might have found something while we were out of radio contact. I talked about the weather, the cold front pushing through, the forecast for the next few days. I talked about department procedures, training requirements, the challenges of law enforcement in rural areas. Meaningless talk, filler. The kind of conversation two people might have on a long hike when they've run out of substantive things to discuss. Every word was calculated to project normalcy, to maintain the fiction that nothing had changed between us. Every sentence was a small performance designed to keep Kyle believing that his mask was still working. He responded appropriately to everything I said. Calm, cooperative, engaged. He asked follow-up questions about the department, commented on the weather, expressed hope that the other teams had made progress. His demeanor was exactly what it had been since we first met at the staging area. That same pleasant competence, that same easy rapport. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought we were just two people wrapping up a long day of difficult work, tired but satisfied with our efforts. But I did know better now, and everything about his responses felt different. The silences between exchanges stretched longer than they should have. The pauses before his answers carried weight they hadn't carried before. I found myself analyzing every word he spoke, looking for hidden meanings, for signs that he knew I knew. The conversation had become a chess game, each of us moving pieces across an invisible board, neither willing to acknowledge the stakes. The terrain required my attention, which was both a blessing and a curse. The trail was difficult to follow in the failing light, and I had to watch my footing constantly to avoid a misstep that could end badly. But that same need for attention meant I couldn't watch Kyle as closely as I wanted to. I developed a rhythm. Look ahead, navigate, glance back, confirm his position, look ahead again. The glances were quick, casual, the kind of thing anyone might do to make sure their hiking partner was keeping up. But each glance was also an assessment. How close was he? Where were his hands? What was his expression? The answers were always the same. He was maintaining a consistent distance, about 10 feet back. His hands were visible, relaxed at his sides, or occasionally touching a tree for balance. His expression was neutral, focused on the terrain. Nothing threatening, nothing suspicious, just a man walking through the woods. But I couldn't shake the awareness of what he might be capable of. I thought about what he might be thinking as we walked. Whether this had always been part of his plan, the helpful friend who searched all day alongside law enforcement and then went home with his alibi intact. Whether the goal from the beginning had been to control the search, to steer it away from Sarah's location, and then to disappear back into his normal life while the investigation went nowhere, or whether something had changed in those last miles in the drainage, whether he'd sensed a shift in me, a new wariness that hadn't been there before, whether he was walking behind me right now, calculating his own options, weighing the risks of letting me reach the staging area against the risks of doing something about it out here where there were no witnesses. The thoughts were dark, spiraling, the kind of paranoid speculation that doesn't help anything, but I couldn't stop them. Every snap of a branch behind me triggered a fresh cascade of tactical calculations. The forest gradually thinned as we climbed out of the drainage, the trees spacing further apart, the undergrowth giving way to more open terrain. I could see the sky now, a deep blue fading to black, the first stars appearing overhead. We were getting close. The fire road was maybe a quarter-mile ahead, and from there it was a straight shot back to the staging area. I could feel the tension in my shoulders beginning to ease slightly, the promise of safety drawing closer with every step. But I didn't let my guard down. Not yet. Not until I was surrounded by other people, other deputies, the floodlights and vehicles and radio chatter of the command post. Kyle was still behind me. Kyle was still an unknown quantity, and the last quarter mile could be as dangerous as the first 5 if I let myself get complacent. We emerged from the tree line onto the fire road just as the last light faded from the sky. Ahead, maybe half a mile distant, I could see the glow of the staging area. Floodlights on portable stands, headlights from vehicles, the small shapes of people moving around, other search teams returning from their sectors, safety, witnesses, backup. I felt something loosen in my chest. A knot I hadn't fully realized was there. Kyle came up beside me on the wider road, matching my pace as we walked toward the lights. He made a comment about being glad to be out of the drainage, about how the dark had come faster than he'd expected. I agreed. I smiled. He smiled back. 2 tired searchers heading in after a long day, relieved to be done, hoping for good news from the other teams. That's what anyone watching would have seen. 2 men walking side by side, smiling, united in purpose. They wouldn't have known that we were smiling for very different reasons. The moment we reached the staging area, I pulled the search coordinator aside. His name was Lieutenant Davis, a 20-year veteran who'd run more missing person operations than he could count. I told him I had concerns about one of the volunteers. I told him about the inconsistencies I'd observed over the past 2 days, the specific knowledge about Sarah's preferences that Kyle shouldn't have had, the steering, the subtle redirection of our search toward certain areas and away from others, the mud on his boots that came from terrain we hadn't covered, and the question, that carefully phrased question about decomposition that used past tense, certain tense, as if Sarah's fate was already known. Davis listened without interrupting. He took notes. He nodded in the places where you're supposed to nod when someone is telling you something serious. Then he asked me if I had any evidence. Any physical proof. Anything beyond observations and gut feelings. I told him I didn't. I told him what I had was a pattern, a collection of small things that added up to something larger, something that pointed toward Kyle Weber being more than just a helpful friend of the boyfriend. Davis was quiet for a long moment after I finished. He looked over at Kyle, who was standing near the coffee station, chatting with another volunteer, looking exactly like what he claimed to be. Then Davis said he'd have someone talk to Weber, ask some follow-up questions, see if anything shook loose. He said it in the careful tone of a supervisor who wants to take a subordinate's concerns seriously without committing to anything that might blow back on the department. I understood. I didn't like it, but I understood. Accusations require evidence. Suspicions don't get you a warrant. The system works the way it works, and gut feelings from a deputy aren't enough to detain a citizen who hasn't been observed doing anything wrong. Kyle was questioned that night by 2 detectives from the Criminal Investigations Unit. I wasn't present for the interview, but I read the report later. He remained calm throughout, cooperative, helpful. He had explanations for everything. The mud on his boots. He'd done some preliminary scouting yesterday before the official briefing, eager to start looking, and had walked through some wet terrain near a different trailhead. The specific knowledge about Sarah's hiking preferences. Tyler had mentioned it during the 3-hour drive from Bend, going over every detail he could think of in his desperation to help. The question about decomposition, anxiety, morbid thoughts, the kind of dark speculation that anyone might engage in during a difficult search. He apologized if it had seemed inappropriate. He was just worried about his friend's girlfriend. The detectives thanked him for his cooperation. They told him he was free to go. There was no physical evidence, no probable cause, no reason to hold him. Kyle Weber walked out of that staging area the same way he'd walked in. 11 days later, 2 hunters found Sarah's body in a ravine about 3 miles east of where the official search had ever looked. The location was in a sector that had been assigned to a different team, a sector Kyle had subtly steered us away from every time I'd suggested we coordinate with other groups. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a fall or a blow from a heavy object. The medical examiner couldn't determine which. The case was ruled inconclusive. No arrests were made. I requested the search grid maps from those 2 days and studied them for hours, tracing the paths we'd taken, the decisions we'd made. Kyle had effectively chosen his own sector. He'd volunteered to be paired with a deputy. He'd spent 16 hours guiding law enforcement away from Sarah's location while appearing to be our most dedicated volunteer. Everything by the book. Everything deniable. Everything designed to create the perfect alibi while ensuring the body wouldn't be found until the trail had gone cold. I've thought about those 2 days more than I can count. I've run through the conversations, the suggestions, the small moments of hesitation and redirection. I've wondered what would have happened if I'd confronted him in the drainage, if I'd said the words out loud and forced the situation to a crisis. Maybe he would have confessed. Maybe he would have run. Maybe he would have done something desperate, and one of us wouldn't have walked out of those woods. I'll never know. What I know is that I spent 16 hours hiking beside a man who had killed someone, making small talk, sharing trail mix, calling a dead woman's name into trees where she would never answer. I know that Kyle Weber decided to let me walk out of that forest, and I still don't understand why. Maybe the plan required a witness to his cooperation. Maybe confrontation was never the intent. Maybe he was weighing his options the same way I was weighing mine, and we both chose the same cautious path. Kyle Weber disappeared after the search ended. The address he'd given was valid, but he wasn't there when investigators followed up. The phone number went to voicemail and was eventually disconnected. Tyler Reed, the boyfriend, claimed not to know where his friend had gone, said they'd lost touch after Sarah's death, that the grief had driven them apart. The case remains open. No charges have ever been filed. And somewhere out there, Kyle Weber is living his life, maybe using a different name, maybe in a different state, maybe finding other opportunities to be helpful. I think about him every October, when the light fails early and the temperature drops, when the forest turns golden and then dark. I think about the walk out of that drainage, the 45 minutes of careful conversation and controlled terror. I think about the way he smiled when we reached the staging area, shook my hand, and said he hoped they'd find Sarah tomorrow. Every time a volunteer shows up to a search now, calm and competent and just a little too knowledgeable, I watch. I wait. And I remember the lesson Kyle Weber taught me. The monsters don't always run. Sometimes they stay. Sometimes they help. And sometimes they walk right beside you, smiling in the dark.